Well, greetings, everyone. This is Oubai Shahbandar, your moderator here with that TRT World from Istanbul, where we will just begin our session to discuss President Biden administration's strategy towards Eurasia, the possible outcomes. It's coming at a very important time when this administration likes to boast that, quote, diplomacy is back, and that the US is, quote, back on the world stage. So we will be here to discuss if that really is the case. And can we really say that there's been a measurable shift towards American foreign policy in Eurasia from this administration's predecessors? So we will discuss critical issues related to US policy towards Russia, Iran, China, and big power competition, particularly when it comes to US-Chinese relations and competition in the Pacific, Beijing's treatment of its Muslim ethnic Uyghur population, and of course, what many are calling an ongoing Cold War between the United States and China. Regarding Russia, we heard President Putin recently saying that the Kremlin has, quote, constructive relations with Washington, but we know that behind the scenes, tensions do remain between the former Cold War foes. And just today, notably, the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was in Ukraine, where he promised to support Kiev against what he called, quote, Russian aggression. So a lot to talk about, particularly with the US standoff with Iran over its nuclear program, as that standoff continues, and with concerns in the region, particularly from America's ally Israel, that it may be ready for a plan B, which means military strikes. So joining us today to discuss all these important topics are our main speakers for the panel. First, Susan Elliott, the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and the former US Ambassador to Tajikistan. And Alexander Cooley, the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science and Director of the Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. And Barbara Slavin, the Director, Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And Mikhail Troitsky, the Dean of the School of Government and International Affairs, the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Thank you all for joining me, and let's get right into it. We'll start with Susan. The floor is yours.
You'd think I would have learned by now that I need to unmute myself, but thanks very much for having me today. And I think I'd like to just start out with, talking a little bit about what has the Biden administration laid out as the pillars of their national security strategy, because I think while these are broad framework for the globe, many of these, if not all, have implications for US policy toward Eurasia. And, now that we're 10 months into the administration, these were laid out probably back in early spring, in March, when Secretary Blinken took office. I think this is a good time to look at, take a stand and see where are we on the Biden administration's ambitious policies. And just for the audience, we don't have time to really go into all of these in depth, but some of the priorities are renewing democracy around the world, because as we all know, democracies are more stable, more open, less prone to conflict, and provide dependable markets for goods and services around the world, which in turn would improve the global economy, which again is another priority for the Biden administration, and to also improve US global technology leadership. One of the things I think that probably in Eurasia that is extremely important, and again around the world, but is to stop the COVID-19 pandemic and to strengthen global health security. I think that, the US rejoining the World Health Organization and becoming a strong contributor to COVAX certainly has helped the region. But I think that we need to not only continue this, but the US, I hope, will do more in providing vaccines for developing countries. I think another priority for the Biden administration is climate change, looking at affecting the climate crisis. Of course, we all know he's appointed Secretary of State John Kerry to be the envoy for climate change. We rejoined the Paris Accord, and I think we're looking forward to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow next month, so that we can begin to accelerate actions and look for ways that we can, deal with the climate change. But I think for Eurasia, to me, the ones that I think are of particular interest is revitalizing our ties with allies and partners, because these relationships, I think, are extremely important, at least for me, who as a career diplomat spent most of my career working on Asia and countries of former Soviet Union. And the administration has done a lot, I think, to reestablish relationships. And we mentioned Iran at the beginning, but we had started again, and I know a lot of work has been going on in Vienna to try to rejoin and bring Iran back into compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The President Biden has held early quadrilateral security dialogues with Japan, Australia, and India, and not only in the spring, but then after UNGA. And while we know that these strengthen our relationships with partners and allies, a lot of the focus of the discussion, I'm sure, was on how to deal with China. And we can certainly talk about perhaps maybe things that didn't go quite as well in the first 10 months of the administration. How well did we coordinate on the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan? And how well did we coordinate, again, with our partners and allies on the recent trilateral agreement we had with Australia on submarines? But I think for me, having been someone who now works on China, but served twice in Moscow, I think managing our relationship with China, which is one of the priorities that Secretary Blinken outlined as the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century, is really important. And Biden said that our relationship with China has to be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. And they talk about a common denominator, which is to engage China for a position of strength. I don't see this as necessarily military strength, but I think we need to strengthen, our economic positions, which I think, if we have a level playing field and try to work together on economic issues, that would help us to avoid adversarial confrontations. I was very pleased recently to see that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with China's top diplomat, and I hope that that this will lead to similar strategic dialogues between the U.S. and China. For those of you who don't know, the organization that I lead, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, has conducted Track 2 discussions for many years with counterparts from mainland China, Taiwan, and the U.S. And we also continue to have strategic dialogues with our Chinese counterparts. Again, Track 2, for those of you who don't know, is informal, not government to government, but scholar to scholar, and we make policy then recommendations to respective governments. I've seen the importance of these informal dialogues, especially during the pandemic when other channels of communication were not open. And I do hope that Beijing and Washington can find a way to begin more formal dialogues like the US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which took place back in the Obama administration. But having been someone who has lived twice in Russia, was US Ambassador to Tajikistan, I also hope that we can look, that the US will look for ways to work and engage and better manage our relationship with Russia. That wasn't mentioned in the initial priorities, but I also think it's extremely important. I personally was very glad to see that President Biden met with President Putin earlier this year in Geneva, and that they agreed to a bilateral strategic stability dialogue. And we've seen that that's already it wasn't just words, it's begun to be implemented. And Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman and Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov met in late September, I believe in Geneva. And I hope that this dialogue will continue. In fact, I think that they've set up some working groups to discuss different issues. But as a career diplomat and an optimist, I think the Biden administration have set the right course for their foreign policy. And I think Secretary Blinken is working hard at trying to achieve the objectives and the course that they set. But as I close, I want to remember today my former boss, Colin Powell, who passed away yesterday. most of you know he had 13 rules that he lived and worked by, and I saw how he followed those rules. But those rules, I believe, are why he was successful in everything he did, not only a successful diplomat, but military leader. But I want to leave you with the 13th rule with perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. I'm an optimist, and Secretary Powell said, if the people around you feed off your optimism, that self-belief will be contagious. And if you believe and you've prepared your followers, the followers will believe. So I believe that, the Biden administration has started off on a good course. Are there bumps in the road? Are there lots of challenges that we face? Yes. But I'm looking forward to doing what I can to be helpful in that area. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Susan, so much for your initial statement and great point about the late General Colin Powell. All right, next, Alexander Cooley. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to follow Ambassador Elliott and her comments. I'm going to pick up on some of these themes. I'm especially interested in the Biden administration's both emerging strategy towards Eurasia, but also trying to analyze how what is happening in Eurasia now gives us broader clues as to just the nature of the world and how the world has changed over the last 2 decades in ways that perhaps aren't obvious and are, I think, difficult for American audiences to sort of fully appreciate. I would point out that Eurasia has been the source of 2 serious local conflicts that had overtones of conflict with Russia. In 2008, in terms of the Russia-Georgia war, and in 2014, the Ukraine crisis and conflict. In both of those cases, what were local regional disputes had an overlay of the US and the West against Russia in terms of the US promoting the Western orientation and the integration of these post-Soviet states into transatlantic architectures and networks. One of the things that we see is actually there hasn't been this kind of aggressive support for the sovereignty and independence of the post-Soviet states as there have been in some previous administrations. And this isn't because the relationships aren't important. President Biden was on the vice presidential ticket during the Georgia war, and he takes these relationships seriously. But rather, there is sort of a sense that the US can't do everything in all places. And I absolutely agree that China has become the main geostrategic focus. Relations with Russia are not great, but there have been some steps taken to make them more stable, more predictable, to try and get dialogues going. And as a result, the prioritization of this kind of transatlantic integration that we've had in the past hasn't been as overt. I would actually point out that President Zelensky, although yes, there was an affirmation of US-Ukrainian partnership and friendship and dialogue, he didn't receive some major things that he wanted, right? He did not get the Biden administration to agree to negotiation the Minsk format. He did not receive a sort of renewed invitation to join NATO. And of course, the Biden administration waived sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 project earlier in the year, which disappointed many in Kiev. So it hasn't been this kind of unequivocal backing that I think some had expected and hoped to be. And in part, I think that reflects a desire to sort of keep things calm, especially in terms of sort of US-Russia ties. I would say also that the shift on democracy has changed somewhat from this idea of kind of promoting democratization, NGOs. There's the so-called legacy of the color revolutions that saw regimes sort of collapse after fraudulent elections in Georgia, in Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan in the mid-2000s. And Russia and some other countries came to regard these as not pro-democracy interventions, but as regime changes. They came to view them as security threats. And so the Biden administration has emphasized less sort of democracy as a vehicle for changing regime and more as a process of supporting democratic norms and civil society. So the Summit for Democracy, I think, is trying to dial back the kind of volatility associated with promoting democracy and make it more about building a political community according to a shared group of ideals. The final area I want to talk about is a little bit what's happened in Afghanistan and in Central Asia, because I think this gives us a sense of the before and after picture of how the world has evolved the last couple of decades. So after the attacks of 9/11, the US intervened quite quickly in Central Asia, and it set up military bases to use for its Afghanistan campaign in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, in Kyrgyzstan, also some temporary rights in Tajikistan. And Russia and China were supportive of these efforts. They supported them for different reasons. Russia, because it wanted to partner back then with the US, it wanted to be seen as speaking on behalf of the Central Asian states in this sort of global effort. China, because it saw the opportunity to graft its own attempt to sort of crack down on what was going on in Xinjiang and Uyghur groups and movements and place them within the overall framework of the war on terror. Nevertheless, they were supportive. That changes over the course of the next 2 decades. And both Moscow and Beijing, especially after major combat operations are over in Afghanistan, start viewing the US presence in Central Asia as not to counter terrorism, but rather to spread its own influence in Eurasia, right? And they start to perceive the bases in the US military presence as a threat. In fact, Russia supports Uzbekistan's eviction of the US in 2005. It tries to provide an aid and investment package to Kyrgyzstan later to try and evict the US. It starts competing with the US, and it views the US's presence as one of sort of strategic competition. One of, I think, the interesting developments out of the Afghanistan withdrawal is that you've seen the Biden administration trying to secure renewed basing rights to be able to conduct intelligence and surveillance operations, flying drones from some of the bordering countries. So far to no success. And President Putin in the summit with President Biden was absolutely adamant that Moscow does not want any independent negotiations between the United States and the Central Asian states. And I think one of the things that it points to is that in that last 2 decades, the very presence of the US spurred both Russia and China to create their own regional organizations for both security matters and economic matters. And so the US isn't really leaving a vacuum. It's leaving a number of institutions and relationships that can provide order and governance on non-Western, non-US terms in the region. And so what I find particularly intriguing now is that, you know, Central Asia is going to become this sphere of, can you have a multipolar world without the US playing a prominent part that can provide security and good governance across the region? And I think the jury's very much out on that. But we're seeing Moscow hosting regional talks. Iran is going to host them in a few weeks. There's a real kind of different kind of ordering fabric to the region right now. And the very final point is, even though we're in this kind of new strategy of what was great power competition has now become strategic competition, I think it would be quite a bad idea if we positioned ourselves vis-a-vis the Central Asian states or any of the Eurasian states as clear poles in a competition. The Central Asian states that border China or that border Russia, they can't change their geography. These relationships are important to them. It's important not to put them on the spot to choose in the names of great power competition. Instead, the US should be available for partnership, for investment, for education, technical assistance, cooperation in public health, all these things. But it shouldn't be framed in a strategically competitive way, because I fear then that puts them in a tight spot, and I think it fuels greater kinds of narratives of global competition that aren't helpful right now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alexander. Excellent points, and it'd be really interesting to see how the Nord Stream 2 pipeline plays out, especially during these times of increasing energy prices and the potential fallout in Central Asia with the Central Asian states in the post-American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Thank you so much for your statements. And now next is Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me. It's really august company, and I have to say that I endorse a lot of what the previous speakers have said about the Biden foreign policy. I see a Biden administration that is more like the Obama administration in some ways, in that it's not looking for enemies. It will defend American interests, but this demonization that we saw so much of during the Bush administration, also during the Trump administration, I think that is blessedly gone. And I'm laughing at all this talk of a new Cold War with China. I don't think that's what the United States wants. I see Biden as trying to build coalitions around issues. And I see this very much in terms of the Iran talks, which of course I follow very closely. There was an effort to return to the agreement, to return to full compliance with it. That began fairly quickly, maybe not quickly enough for some, but fairly quickly after Biden took office. Then there was an interruption because of Iranian presidential elections. And it is taking this new Iranian administration, not so new Iranian administration, a rather long time to get back into talks. And we can talk a little bit about what the reasons for that might be. But the US, is showing a little bit of frustration. We do hear a little bit of talk about a plan B, but I don't think there really is a plan B, apart from trying to get Europeans, Chinese, Russians, regional countries, Iran's neighbors, to all try to persuade Iran that it is better off if it returns to this compliance with this deal, as well as the international community, that it will reduce tensions, it will prevent a new arms race in the region. And of course, the Iranian economy, while it has survived so-called maximum pressure, has certainly not thrived, and would do much better if it could be better integrated into the international financial system in particular. We see that Iran has a new agreement, strategic agreement with China. Iran, frankly, did its pivot to China a long time ago, partly as a result of sanctions that were imposed beginning more than a decade ago over its nuclear program. But to really be able to benefit from that relationship, Iran needs sanctions relief. Same is true of Iran's membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's now been accepted, at least to begin the process of becoming a full member. But there are many countries in that organization that cannot trade freely with Iran unless it gets back into the nuclear agreement and it has relief from secondary sanctions and its central bank is no longer targeted. So I still see that this is a very strong priority for the Biden administration. We will see if it's a strong priority for Iran. I hope it will be. I think there are a couple of other steps that have been taken. I don't know if anyone noticed, but the CIA very quietly ended its special program devoted to Iran. It's created a China House instead. And a gentleman known as Ayatollah Mike, who was responsible for a lot of attacks on Iran, not just sanctions, but things like the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. He has quietly retired. And so the message is that the Biden administration would like Iran to get back into the nuclear deal fully, would like it to not interfere in a negative way in the affairs of its neighbors, but the US is not looking to change the regime in Iran. That is something for Iranians to do. The US may do various things to promote interconnectivity for Iranians, to make sure they have access to satellite television and various social media and that sort of thing, but it's not going to be with an eye to overthrowing the Iranian regime, which for all its flaws, is still there after all these years. A few other points I think are of note. Iran has been selling up to 1 million barrels of oil a day to China throughout the last few months, and the U.S. has not done anything in particular to try to stop this. There's been no effort, apart from a few designations, I think, for terrorism and human rights abuses, to really ratchet up what are already very extreme sanctions against Iran. And the Treasury Department even came out with an interesting statement yesterday on sanctions and how sanctions should be properly handled, with an emphasis on multilateralism, an emphasis on clear and specific goals for sanctions, and also a path to their removal. So not this sort of wholesale effort to escalate pressure that we saw under the Trump administration. One other point I think that's useful, of course, the Biden administration, as soon as it came in, got rid of the so-called Muslim ban. There are Iranian students who can come to the United States again. And I recently heard that there hopefully will be a revival of athletic exchanges. Iranian wrestlers have been invited to come back to the United States for some friendly matches early next year. I hope that Iran will agree. This was a very good effort that we saw frankly, starting more than 2 decades ago, and it creates a lot of goodwill. I'd also like to see the Biden administration do more on the COVID front. There has been a request by Iran for an IMF loan that has gone nowhere. The US also should make available vaccines if the Iranians would like them, perhaps from non-US manufacturing sites, but I would like to see more of an effort there. And finally, and this may be a positive comment that came from the Iranian government recently, as you may know, Iran is holding several American detainees, and the US also has Iranians in jail in the United States. And the Iranian government has said they don't want to connect this to the nuclear talks, and that's fine. They should agree to talk directly and resolve this on a humanitarian basis. Some of these detainees are quite old and in poor health. And of course, some of the charges against them, against the Americans in Iran, are of rather dubious qualities. So this would be another very important goodwill gesture on the part of both countries if we could resolve this issue of the detainees. So perhaps I'll stop there and wait for questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for that. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more to discuss when it comes to Iran. And now next is Mikhail Troitsky from Moscow. Sir, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oubai, and my honor to be here on this distinguished panel. So thank you for having me. And in my few minutes here, I thought I'd discuss Biden's policy in Eurasia in terms of the difficult choices that every politician has to make in order to succeed, right? So your resources are always limited and you are pressed hard to choose among the available options, and avoiding tough choices would very likely result in no political benefits being ultimately reaped, while you'll still have to face many problems that will remain and haunt you. So regarding Eurasia, Biden has indeed made 2 stark and difficult choices that have had serious implications for Eurasia. The first one is to confront China on democracy grounds and to keep up the pressure on trade and technology, perhaps now also on arms control. And the second tough choice was, of course, to pull out of Afghanistan on a tight schedule. And those choices were indeed super important. And they entailed significant costs for the Biden administration. And yet, I would say they have not revealed the strategic preferences of the Biden administration for much of the rest of Eurasia. They are like those choices are like 2 dots in a 3-dimensional space, which requires a few more dots to build a surface of your policy. Now, I would argue, and that is not to detract from the achievements of the Biden administration, of course, but I would argue that Biden has simply not revealed the choices he has actually made, but that he and his administration may have chosen to just kind of to keep private, not to reveal early on for some reason. But there's indeed a vision that he has for Eurasia. Why do I think so? And my main argument has to do with the way Biden has so far pursued negotiations with Russia. Now, President Biden himself has not been offensive or assertive with respect to Russia or President Putin, other than the initial George Stephanopoulos interview in April. But since April, he has engaged in both summit diplomacy and negotiations on the range of issues that are important to Russia and the United States at the same time. So you name it, you look at arms control, there he extended the new START treaty. You look at strategic stability, and here the United States and Russia have talks on redefining strategic stability. You take cyber, and there you just heard about a UN resolution being tabled and sponsored jointly by the United States and Russia on cyber rules of conduct. And you take Ukraine, there have been many visits and much interaction between Moscow and Washington. Of course, U.S. Defense Secretary just blamed Russia for the conflict in the east of Ukraine, but that's hardly a new position. And apparently the Biden administration thinks it is onto something with Russia because it is prepared to absorb the costs of such policy. And the costs have been quite significant, right? So so information about actual negotiation between Russia and the United States has been very scarce. But there has been no grandstanding or politicizing contradictions despite domestic political pressures on the Biden administration. And issues of rights, of human rights, political rights, are not being openly raised. And Russia has hardly been mentioned in the context of the struggle of democracy against autocracy. And no major rounds of sanctions are forthcoming. I think the administration will be able to block almost any push from the Congress under the circumstances. And we have seen the Trump administration doing that very successfully. Now, the Wall Street Journal just reported today that the United States is going just to cut down on the use of sanctions in its foreign policy. And Biden is indeed prepared to take the flak from both left and right for failing to teach Putin a lesson. And there has been no clear teaming up with allies, no open teaming up with allies on Russia, unlike teaming up on China that is going on full steam. On the contrary, restrictions on the pipeline Nord Stream 2 were indeed lifted. So the approach is clear. Despite differences with some allies over Russia, Biden keeps as many lines of communication open as possible. A second summit, by the way, in 6 months, half a year is now in the making between Biden and Putin, despite the criticism that Biden had to face at home in the wake of the Geneva summit in June. Okay, and all of this suggests, from my perspective, that the sides are onto something. Something is brewing, and they believe there can be clear benefits from continuing the engagement. And I am only trying to guess what that could be. Perhaps a new arms control treaty, or maybe a lasting solution for Ukraine, or maybe some kind of agreement distancing Russia from China. But these all look like grand bargains, and these grand bargain type of deals do not seem likely because there are too many moving parts, there are too many other stakeholders and interests involved. So therefore, I conclude from my sort of point of view that there's more than meets the eye. And at the very least, for the time being, both sides seem to be just postponing their strategic choices while they believe that their engagement, their negotiation process serves their long-term strategic interests. And if I have just one more minute, related to this US-Eurasia bilateral business, US Russia bilateral business in Eurasia, there's of course this China-US Russia triangle that has always been exciting. So I should use this chance to talk a little bit about that. And I would just offer a short comment on the Belt and Road Initiative and the possible perspectives on that from Moscow and also perhaps from Washington. So should the United States and Russia be worried about the BRI? That was one of the questions that was offered to our panel. And it seems that almost a decade since its launch, BRI is not and should not be perceived as a major challenge to Russia and the United States. It has a positive side. Any new infrastructure is, of course, useful as long as it increases connectivity. But I'm not sure China is excited about increased connectivity all over the place. From a security perspective, plenty of connectivity between China and some pockets in Central Asia may even be fraught with security risks for China, given the Xinjiang situation. But the main reason, and that's my final point, not to worry about BRI for both Russia and the United States, is that any expensive initiative such as BRI may only increase your hard power if you have a substantial amount of soft power vis-a-vis your partners in such an initiative, right? So you're only able to leverage the infrastructure that you are helping to build for security and other strategic purposes if you are seen as beyond pragmatic by your counterparts, if you are seen as driven by common causes and values. And the problem for China has been as of late that it lacks exactly this kind of soft power in relations with its neighbors that you need to leverage if you want to leverage your investment in infrastructure for security and strategic purposes, and maybe use it as a springboard for alliance building or community building. So overall, in terms of risks of a great power conflict, I think Eurasia seems to be fine, to be all good, not so much new to worry about. That would be my conclusion based on the sort of great power discussion and great power postures as of now vis-a-vis Eurasia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail. And it's been very interesting, as you noted, to observe the progression of the Biden administration's foreign policy towards Russia, perhaps not as hardline as many had expected, given the campaign rhetoric and the criticism of his predecessor, President Trump. Okay, and now to the second part of our panel. I'm going to introduce our discussants. Starting off will be Helen Sari-Artem, the Associate Professor, Istanbul Medeniyet University, and Richard Outzen, a geopolitical consultant in the US, Lauren Speranza, the Director of Transatlantic Defense and Security at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and Zoe Liu, the Instructional Assistant Professor at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service, and Mr. Talha Kose, the Coordinator, SETA Brussels Office and an Associate Professor of Political Science at the Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. I'd just like to remind you that each one of you will have around 5 minutes to make your points and your statements, and we'll start off with Helen Sari-Artem. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to listen to you tonight. A very interesting discussion is going on, actually. Interesting points made by each speaker. So I would like to start with Susan Elliott, if I may. For a while, I've been studying on the relations between China and the United States. The basic point, as you can imagine, is whether a new Cold War is close to us. This is a big discussion in almost every international conference among IR scholars, among diplomats, and so on. Even today, my students were asking questions whether they can find any resources on a possible Cold War between China and the United States. And I asked, please ask Mearsheimer regarding this question, because Mearsheimer is one of the scholars who have been defending that the United States should certainly have a containment strategy, a new containment strategy against China. I'm wondering, regarding your points, whether it's possible to have a containment strategy in the 21st century where there's such a big complex relationship between various actors, not only the states, but also the new actors, NGOs, multinational organizations, corporations, and so on. So Susan Elliott especially mentioned about AUKUS, not maybe exactly mentioned about AUKUS, the Quad and so on, but I also got the clues that she was talking about containment as well, that the United States is somehow trying to do or build some alliances to restart a containment strategy maybe in the region. And I'm one of those experts who is also thinking that it's not easy to have a containment strategy in 21st century. The conditions are quite complex, the actors are quite differentiated, so we don't have the period of Cold War times at the moment. So I'm not sure whether the United States will be able to contain successfully China and have the control of or the support of the close allies in the region, the neighboring countries, I mean, who are around China. I do agree that, as Susan Elliott already mentioned, that Blinken's top priority, the US administration's top priority is the rivalry with China. I'm not sure whether the United States has any grand strategy already defined for us to understand what are the tools or what will be the tools of the United States while it will be making a rivalry or getting in competition with China. Looking at the American society as well, looking at the confusion in the United States foreign policy as well, I do see that there's a gap or a kind of vagueness in defining a new US grand strategy. So I would, if we have time, I would like to have the points of Susan, if possible, whether there is a US grand strategy in the 21st century, especially looking at the Biden administration. Quickly coming to our other speakers, Barbara Slayton, for example, she talked about Iran-China strategic agreement and that Biden is trying to build coalitions around issues. I'm not sure whether the United States will be again successful to build a diplomatic relationship with Iran while let's say the water in Central Asia, in Indo-Pacific region is already warming up. So if we have a close contact, close relationship between Russia, China, as well as Iran, will the Biden administration be able to build strong diplomatic relations with Iran, possibly? I'm not sure. So things are really complicated in my point of view. Coming to Alex Cooley's comments, Afghanistan is a very interesting point. We've been working on that, commenting on that issue in the last couple of months. I wonder whether Alex is thinking that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was ill-prepared, poorly executed, as some of the experts in IR are defending, because this quick withdrawal from Afghanistan caught us in surprise. Somehow we were all surprised by the speed, by the rapidness of this withdrawal. And at the moment, we, as the regional countries, we are all trying to sort out the negative outcomes of this quick withdrawal from the region. The United States might be thinking that, yeah, okay, I'm out of region at the moment. This is your issue. Solve your problems by yourselves. I think this is not the case. This creates a kind of lack of confidence in close allies in the regional countries like Turkey, for example, or the close neighbors of China like Malaysia, India, Japan, South Korea. They are having a kind of confusion regarding the real intentions of the United States. Okay, we have new alliances like AUKUS or the Quad, but I don't think that these alliances are strong enough like NATO, for example. They are loose alliances, and I am not sure whether these alliances will be able to limit or contain China in the region. Maybe they will make China much more angry and aggressive regarding its policies in Indo-Pacific. I would like to also raise a question to the speakers, if possible, whether they think that the regional countries surrounding China are applying a kind of hedging strategy in which they are trying to minimize the risk of being so close to China, but at the same time trying not to lose the United States. So they are in between two great powers, and they are, in my point of view, trying to create a very careful strategy, and we might possibly call this as a hedging strategy. So as you can see, my basic points are about whether a containment policy, a new containment policy is possible for the United States. And our last speaker, Mikhail Trotsky, interesting to have your views from Russia, because this is a voice from the East. And we, the countries, the regional countries or the great powers in the East, we have different points of view. We have our different understanding regarding the changing dynamics in the region. Looking at China, US, Russia triangle, my last point is whether the Biden administration will be ready to confront China when China and Russia are coming more or less on the same line. Although they have different points of view, I can still see or feel that they are building a kind of block in the East against the West, namely the United States. So I'm not sure whether Biden administration's relentless diplomacy will be enough to stop or to limit these two great powers, namely Russia and China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Some very good points here on U.S. policy towards Russia and China. I know you had some questions to our main speakers that we'll get to right at the end. Coming up, thank you, Professor. Coming up next, Richard Alton, the floor is yours.
Okay, great.
Please
thanks, Oubai. Great to be with you, and great to be part of the conversation. I'll begin with a comment or a lament, perhaps, that trying to understand American grand strategy is trying to solve the world's worst Rubik's Cube, because the fact is American grand strategy, and that in most democracies, in my view, is grand strategy is highly aspirational. It's always emergent, and it is always subordinate to policy and politics. That's the fact of any democracy, but especially so one with the separation of powers that we have in the US system. So in fact, we produce foreign policy, we do on a daily basis. We don't produce grand strategies that stick. So it's always sort of trying to figure out which pieces of it are being applied at any given time. So with that in mind, though, looking at the outlines of what we see here, I want to do two things. One is to talk about what we've seen so far, which is not a national security strategy, but an interim national security guidance that came out of the administration. What I see of that is essentially a continuation of what has been called the Obama doctrine. There was both a work by Jeffrey Goldberg, informed by a long-form interview with President Obama, and the one that I prefer is a book by Colin Dweck that also sort of addressed in his second term what he thought the Obama doctrine was. It's been variably referred to as no drama Obama, don't do stupid stuff. It can also just be called sort of restraint, I suppose, in that view. And in the Obama administration, with great continuity because of both ideas and people in the Biden administration, what we saw in essence was the avoidance of problems, sort of a Hippocratic oath for the international system. That really results from a focus on domestic policy at the expense of foreign policy focus. The Obama administration, like the Biden administration, has big plans and a big agenda for what it wants to do in terms of domestic reform, healthcare, and also global issues. So global issues defined as COVID and the environment and things like that. And that's what we see in this document, is a desire to sort of focus on domestic transformation. Now, to be a little bit edgy here, I'll say that what distinguishes the Biden version of this from the Obama is less competent implementation. And by that, I'm going to refer both to the AUKUS rollout and to the Afghanistan debacle, which, having served for 2 years in Afghanistan, I was alarmed to see both, because we had a plan to sort of stay and to sort of manage what happened in Afghanistan and maintain some leverage. And that was entirely overwhelmed by events because of the poor implementation. And that has affected our allies in Afghanistan as well as internationally. So let me shift a little bit here, keeping in mind that this means that we have a partial doctrine or a partial foreign policy approach that has had some problems of implementation. But by the way, most administrations start out shaky and get a little better. I fully expect that in the case of the Biden administration as well. What about the theme of the conference here, Eurasia and China and so forth? Well, surprisingly, in many ways, there's been a continuity both on China and in Russia from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. Now, the Biden administration is coming to grips with the fact that China has a direct and multiple times stated capability and intent to deal with its Taiwan issue. That's a huge problem. And for people who want to understand why that's a huge problem that a perpetual optimism can't solve, I highly recommend Elbridge Colby's new book that came out last week on his recommendations for a U.S. grand strategy, or at least defense strategy, which is called A Strategy of Denial. And what that means, and I'll go to Helene's comment here on, is this containment? It's not containment. In Colby's formulation, what the United States needs to do is deny hegemony to any single player in Eurasia and globally. Now, is China, are we in a Cold War with China, or is China trying to do something other than get a rightful seat at the table? I think we need to take them at their word on this. And they've been saying for decades now that their goal is primacy, not equality, in Eurasia by 2049. They've been saying since the publication of Unrestricted Warfare, the book by two People's Liberation Army colonels in the 90s, that they are now waging war against the United States across a variety of spectrums and domains. So there's also this concept of the three warfarers with propaganda and so forth. Look, the Chinese know they're in a struggle with us. They're waging that struggle. If you want to call that a Cold War, or if you just want to call it strategic competition, it is something that's happening despite our efforts to facilitate for 2 decades a consensual rise of China. Does that mean that we need to contain them? I agree with Helene. Containment's not in the cards. They're too big, too powerful in many ways. I'm with Bridge Colby on this, who says that the best way to deny hegemony to the Chinese, not to deny their legitimate role in the system, is to meticulously work alliances and maintain anti-hegemonic coalitions. And that means working with AUKUS. It means working with the Quad, Australia, Japan, India, and other powers, and maintaining the things that are important to the United States and its partners, like freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. This does not, and obviously there will be some frictions with China. I don't think we need to seek a big war, but we certainly need to be convincing to the Chinese and to our allies that we're not going to leave them alone or abandon them in the face of hegemonic behavior if that's the route that China wants to go down. Now, we just need to recognize China from 2020 to 2050 is not going to be the China of 1995 to 2020. In the 1995 to 2020 period, they were seeking World Trade Organization accession and trying to grow their economy through integration with the West. And they've reached some certain milestones in that, and I think they have something broader in mind now. So just a couple comments to finish up. I loved Susan Elliott's comments about Colin Powell, who I had the pleasure to meet once, although we were more than a generation separated in our military service. I will say that of his 13 rules, the one that says that perpetual optimism is a force multiplier is one that deserves an asterisk, because it works when you're doing organizational management, but it's woefully dangerous when it comes to geopolitics, because autocrats and practitioners of realpolitik are not impressed by our perpetual optimism. And it's easy to have your lunch money stolen if you don't have a very jaded eye about some of these hard power conflicts. I thought what Professor Troitsky said there about the Biden administration's grand strategy not being revealed yet is very generous. I think it's not that it's not revealed. I think it's still in formation. I've gone through this process with the previous administration. It takes months and months to get through the sorts of compromises that it takes to get a real, at least theoretically coherent strategy. And I think we're not quite there yet. Look, I want to just finish by saying that for our friends in Turkey and in the Turkic world and in much of Eurasia, the United States needs to do a better job of figuring out those countries that are imperfect and irritating, and those countries who actually want to upend the order in which the United States plays a central role. I think Iran and China are revisionist powers that want to undo American power. I think Turkey and most of the Turkic world would like to have good and cooperative relations with the United States in balancing much of Eurasia. Russia, I haven't made my mind up on yet, because I think Russia knows long-term it has as much to fear from China as it does from the United States, and we need to have some forms of pragmatic cooperation. And that goes for Afghanistan and Central Asia as well as the rest. And thank you. It's been great to be on the panel. Bye.
Thank you, Richard. Insightful, as always. Great points on Eurasia. And perhaps the lack of a comprehensive, or yet to be comprehensive, strategic policy by the Biden administration vis-a-vis Russia. Right, and next, Lauren Speranza, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Oubai, and thank you to all of the panelists for a really fantastic discussion so far. I'm really enjoying the conversation, and I thought I would just offer a few observations. I come at this from a defense and security perspective and spend a lot of my time focusing on NATO and the EU and US defense relations through those frameworks. And, you know, I think I agree with a lot of what folks have said so far in terms of, I think the Biden administration came in wanting to primarily see the Eurasia region through this prism of the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. And, you know, I think their intent was to address these things through anti-corruption efforts and supporting democracies, economic development, energy security, lots of the themes that we've touched on already. But I think the intent of the Pentagon and the Defense Department was really kind of all eyes on the Indo-Pacific, and really the focus is going to be China. And, you know, we heard a lot about this narrative of wanting to park the Russia issue. And that's why the US administration kind of took on the New START treaty extension, and also the Geneva summit with President Putin kind of early on in the administration, shook all of the hands of the European allies along the way, and kind of wanted to put that issue to rest so that the US could go and focus elsewhere in the world. And I think that just has not been the case because in some ways, Russia has forced the US administration to pay attention to what's going on in Eurasia as a region, and not only in Eurasia, but I think particularly just looking at some of the recent events, like Russia's military buildup on the border of Ukraine, and that created serious shockwaves in the Black Sea region, and the continuous kind of buzzing of ships and you know, incursions into airspace, I think is really keeping us on edge in conjunction with all of the kind of political and sort of below the threshold of war kind of antagonism and aggression that Russia is orchestrating in the region. And so I think this is forcing us now, the US, to put Eurasia higher on the agenda than maybe it would have been in the security and defense realm. And I think the Secretary of Defense Austin's visit to the Black Sea countries just this week is underlying that. And we're starting to see lots of, you know, good reassuring signs. I think about US commitment to the region, things like the new security pact just signed with Georgia, and you know, a visit to Ukraine. Although I think it's interesting that a lot of the Ukraine conversation has been focused on anti-corruption efforts, even though security is included on the agenda. I think, especially with President Zelensky's visit to Washington, some were surprised that it was, even in the Pentagon meetings, there seemed to be a bit of more focus on anti-corruption efforts than there may have been in prior administrations. So I think that's an overall positive sign that the administration seems to be more interested in security and defense traditionally in the Black Sea region and Eurasia more broadly. That said, I think the events that we've already talked about, you know, the tacit approval of Nord Stream 2, kind of having a soft touch on Georgia's political crisis, a soft touch to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and this kind of signaling that we're shifting away from the Middle East, the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan, AUKUS, all of these things where we have signaled a poor implementation, to Richard's point about kind of lack of ability to successfully execute these things. This has created, I think, a level of unpredictability between the US and its allies that were not there prior to the Trump administration. And I think that inflames all of the concerns in allies and partners about what the future of US leadership really looks like, erodes the trust level there, and what will happen in 2024. So, okay, is America back? Is America really back? I mean, I think you can make the argument that sort of, but, and then, you know, I think the follow-on question to that is for how long? And in 2024, who knows what will happen? And so I think there's a reticence among allies and partners, not just because of that question about the future, but also because the lack of implementation of this actual rebuilding of alliances and coordination and consultation with allies kind of a few levels down, it starts to crumble a bit. So some questions there, I think, about the future. I guess a question that I would be really interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on is, you know, this question we've been talking about the simultaneous challenges of Russia and China, and to Helene's question about, you know, how do we handle Russia-China cooperation? I think there's actually maybe another version of that question, and this gets at the strategic simultaneity point. How can the U.S. manage a crisis happening in the Indo-Pacific at the same time as a Russia-driven crisis happening in Eurasia? And even if they're unrelated, you know, I think we all know Mr. Putin is an opportunist and would look to take advantage of U.S. being distracted in the Indo-Pacific and try to do something in Eurasia at that moment. And as much as the U.S. should be able to and walk and chew gum at the same time and manage both of these things, I think we are seriously lacking in our ability to do that right now. And I would just love to hear thoughts on whether there are certain things that we should be doing to better prepare the US and its allies and partners to take on simultaneous crises in both of those regions. But I'll leave it there and just thank you everyone for the insightful comments and really glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Lauren. A very important question that we will get to. And now next, Zoe Liu from Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It is a great honor to be here and discuss the informative and very insightful talks given by renowned scholars as well as foreign policy experts. I myself come from the international political economy and international finance background, and a lot of my research have been focused on issues in these areas. And I'm very interested and also very moved that, you know, Ambassador Elliott, Professor Cooley, Ms. Slavin, as well as Dean Troitsky have all touched upon one important dimension of the Biden administration foreign policy that I have been following for a long time throughout, you know, America's the course of America's economic statecraft, which is the use of sanctions, especially the administration's recent plan to limit the use of economic and financial sanctions. So I would like to zoom in on this very recent policy change. As our panelists have talked about, you know, this is very important. It's important because it's probably a potential turning point in U.S. foreign policy after successive administrations increasing reliance on sanctions to force foreign states or foreign governments to comply with American interests. Former Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew already warned us that in 2016 that there is a risk of sanction overuse, which could ultimately reduce America's capacity to use sanctions effectively. So I wanted to sort of build on our panel's discussion on this issue, and I want to talk about this in the context of America's strategic competition with China and the implications for Eurasia, where Turkey is strategically located and has been a major player for a long time. The Biden administration's policy change, as our panelists have already talked about, on the use of sanctions, it has important implications for Eurasia, not just because of the region's geostrategic importance or the presence of Russia, Iran, and other major players, but also because Eurasia is an important linchpin in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which itself is an important aspect of U.S.-China strategic competition. The Biden administration have already laid out a plan to kick out its own initiative to counter the influence of China's BRI, namely the Build Back Better World initiative. And so I guess now the question is, what exactly does this recent policy change on the potential use of sanctions? What does this mean for Eurasia area in the context of US-China strategic competition, especially given China's rising influence through the BRI? I'd like to sort of follow up with Professor Cooley's talk on the development in the region and perhaps provide 2 footnotes on China's initiative that perhaps suggest that China has the intention to develop a non-dollar based financial system that can potentially attract countries under US sanctions and give them access to global capital and global market. So the first is China has been using the BRI framework to advance renminbi internationalization through Eurasia area. And then secondly, China has also been pushing for the use of renminbi and the local currencies, or broadly speaking, de-dollarization through multilateral institutions closely related to the Eurasian area, such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So the first one, in terms of China's use of the BRI framework to advance renminbi internationalization in the Eurasia area. So there are 3 specific channels that I've identified in my research. The first is the use of renminbi in cross-border settlement, and the second is the use of bilateral currency swaps to provide or to support the use of renminbi in cross-border settlement. And here it's very interesting that China has signed bilateral currency swaps with 3 of its largest trading partners in the region, including Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. And the third channel in terms of China's push for renminbi internationalization in the area is China's support for the Astana Financial Center. This is very interesting because China's state-owned commercial banks have shown their support in making Astana a renminbi center in the region and promote the development of an offshore yuan market in Eurasia area. So a lot of this initiative shows that China has a strong interest in not using dollar in the area, but rather to promote renminbi internationalization. Now I'd like to sort of provide my second footnote to our panelist discussion, which is China's mobilization of other countries to push for the use of local currency and de-dollarization through multilateral institutions, such as the SCO, as our panelists have observed. As we all know, the SCO was initially established as solely for the purpose of security cooperation, but it has gradually taken on economic dimensions as well. Before 2006, the SCO Shanghai Summit, the members launched the SCO mechanism for interbank cooperation. And then afterwards, members launched the Business Council to facilitate greater economic cooperation. And there are also other recent developments, such as the proposal to establish SCO Development Bank and the SCO Development Fund. And a lot of these ideas is try to incorporate not just the use of local currencies, but also the promotion of using local currency in settlement between SCO members through the region. And I think it's worth to note that China had expressed its interest in using the framework to promote the use of local currency even before the BRI was officially launched. So I guess to conclude my footnote, 2 footnotes to our panelists, by promoting the use of local currencies in bilateral currency swaps or settlements, especially of the use of renminbi along the BRI in the region, as well as China's recent development in terms of, through the regional multilateral institutions. A lot of these developments really correspond to President Xi's strong interest in increasing China's influence through the region, and more specifically in global financial government. And these perhaps suggest that China indeed has this intention to create a potential alternative financial infrastructures that might attract the countries and regions that are under US sanctions. And this relates to the Biden administration's recent policy change in terms of the reconsideration of not abusing US sanction power and an emphasis on renewed commitment to its allies and partners, as Ambassador Elliott just mentioned. So I guess, my question for the panelists is that, how can the US strengthen its sanction power, or for that matter, the power of sanction relief going forward? Thank you very much. It's very good to be here.
Thank you, Zoe, so much. Very insightful points and very important questions for our panelists. But before we get to those, we have Dr. Talha Kose from SETAP. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the excellent comments. I really benefited from this discussion. So the main question when Biden administration came to power was whether the policies would be in line with former Obama policies, or it will be in the line of Trump administration. So the first option would be the continuation of the liberal internationalism, multilateralism, and renewed cooperation with the transatlantic relations, and emphasis more on cooperative approaches and the emphasis on the democratic values and institutions. So that was an option that was expected from European counterparts and some other partners in international politics. Whereas there was the other option, whether this will be in the direction of the Cold War style containment to China especially, and also there were other actors like Russia and Iran. So of course it is too early to mention about such a containment policy, but we see the efforts of balancing in certain areas. So far as we have seen, I agree, Richard, that the main issue right now is balancing rather than forming overall order building efforts of the 1990s and maybe early 2000s. So rather than building an order, rather than approaching holistically the world politics, I think the current approach is the prevention of first of all, the global hegemon, the emerging hegemon, and secondly, preventing the regional hegemons. So rather than, so at definitely the main purpose is the global alternative hegemon, China. So there's a clear emphasis on balancing of the China. However, we cannot consider this as a policy of containment so far. There are elements of balancing. On the other hand, in the regional context, in the Middle East, also Black Sea region, there are efforts to balance potential and hegemons in this region. So those policies are in line this approach. So that's why, despite the alliance between Turkey and US on the framework of NATO, there is too much pressure on, still ongoing pressure on Turkey. So I agree that the Biden administration foreign policy approach strategy is not shaped yet. This is mainly related to how China, because it will probably be defined on the approach that China will define, prefer in the coming years. So the current elements, especially the increasing tensions in Taiwan and the South China Sea, if those tensions increase and if the policies of BRI turns into more of a strategic nature, then the Cold War style containment may initially start with a more limited approach. So we see the elements of softer style of or a little bit more military style of balancing, but I think we cannot argue that there is a holistic understanding of containment. There are some elements of move in that direction. On the other hand, there are countries that are expecting more grand bargaining. So Russia and Iran, especially, they are expecting grand bargaining. They know that the main game is between China and US in this context, and they believe that the conditions are quite ripe for looking for a grand bargain rather than trying to find middle way with the US. So they believe that their relations with China and their strong ties with China will allow them some advantages. So the case for Russia is the same. So President Putin also believes that there may be a possibility of an agreement with US, but it is conditional. So I think if we think US-Russian relations will be key in the long term for the shaping of the Eurasian game. So whether we should expect something like Nixon-style ping-pong policy and engaging, between U.S. and China and against the Soviet, expansionism, Soviet threats, is I think there is some elements. So if in the coming months China increases its presence and pressure on Taiwan and South China Sea, and if there's a decline in tensions in Black Sea, Ukraine, and other regions, the elements of such a new movement, new engagement is possible even with China, with Russia. So I think for the moment, all the options are, I think, on the table for the US, but defining factor will be how China will behave in the coming months. So if there is a more credible, more cooperative China, I think US may prefer, Biden administration may return to liberal internationalism, the rhetoric of use of multilateralism, and return to human rights values. However, if the tension increases, then US administration will likely to drop some of the minor conflicts and will try to incorporate actors or at least postpone the further tensions with Russia and Iran. So it seems that I think the strategic conditions are still quite ripe, but the main defining factor will be China. So my questions to the speakers is how the relations with Russia will be shaped. I think that will be quite a critical defining moment for the nature of Eurasian power competition. I mean, do you expect some, Nixon-style engagement, or do you think the Biden administration will be more likely to postpone or stall the situation, relations with Russia? Thanks for all the comments and thanks for the moderation.
Thank you, Talha. Some very important points and questions posed to our panelists. We now have about 15 minutes left for our discussion and our panel. And I believe we had a number of questions that were posed to our main panelists from our discussants. Let me start with Susan Elliott. I know that we had a couple of questions from Helene and from Lauren on your perspective on how the U.S. can balance its relations with both Russia and China as it seeks to compete with both.
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I was a career diplomat, so I think engagement is extremely important with both. And I agree with something that Barbara said, that I don't think that Cold War, and I also don't like the term containment. I would probably recommend to those listening to read a recent book by Ryan Haas, which is called Stronger. And it talks about, examining the US-China relations and what's the best way for the US to have the greatest success in outpacing China economically and looking at other things. I think it's to improve our own condition. So investing in ourselves and our own way to do it. I know that seems oversimplified, but I go back to the point that I made about, that we are best if we are from a position of strength. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have military strength. I think that's extremely important as well, but we need to look at these other alternatives. And I do think I agree with something that Alexander said, that having lived and worked in Central Asia, I've seen, the work and the kinds of things that both the Chinese and the Russians have done. I think that we do need to think about not putting our partners and friends in Central Asia in a position, or even in in Asia, for that matter, I think someone mentioned about, having to kind of hedge your bets on should you go with China, should you go with the US, but rather, be there, especially in Central Asia, as Alexander mentioned, to be there, to be a presence, and to not expect that our friends will have to choose. And that I believe that we need to, rather than trying to criticize or complain about the Belt and Road Initiative, but, again, are there other alternative things that we could do, to show that America is a good partner in the region. And I would just say that I'm also not concerned. I think Mikhail brought this up too, about maybe a Russia-China alliance against the US. I think, this was something during the previous Cold War that people thought of because of the similar communist policies or strategies. But I think that each country will look at what's best for themselves. And again, as someone who has served and lived in the region and lived in Russia, I hope that we not only can work on our relationship with China, but also work on our relationship with Russia. So I'll leave it at that.
And I'll open up to the rest of the panelists for any follow-ons, whether it's from Alexander, Barbara, or Michelle, any follow-on comments to what we just heard from Susan. Go ahead, Barbara, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a great discussion. And Ambassador Elliott, I absolutely agree. As somebody who studied the old Soviet Union, lived in the old Soviet Union, also lived in China in the 1980s. Enough with Cold Wars, enough with containment. There are so many pressing international issues that require at least a modicum of cooperation, particularly climate, that I think these ideas are really, really outdated. I think there was a mention from Professor Ertem about the US wanting to build a diplomatic relationship with Iran. I mean, that's always been a dream. It's not in the cards. I think what the US wants is a stabilization of that relationship. It doesn't want a further deterioration, doesn't want a nuclear arms race, doesn't want more conflict that would draw US troops in just when we're getting out. I don't know that Iran is a revisionist power. I think that the regime there, I believe Richard Outson said that, I think the regime there just wants to survive and see another supreme leader after Ayatollah Khamenei passes from the scene. And so the question is how they do that. They're happy to have the influence that they have in the region, most of which they picked up from our mistakes. But I think that their ambitions are very much in check there. And fascinating comments from, is it Zhao? Ms. Zhao on sanctions. This is really important. I'm not sure China can do much with internationalizing the renminbi, but I think the US has to stop weaponizing secondary sanctions, that moment has passed. And we understand that sanctions like antibiotics lose their efficacy when they're overused. And I'm very pleased to see some rethinking on that. And finally, back to Susan Elliott, yes, the emphasis is on helping the United States overcome its own significant problems before we preach to the rest of the world. And certainly Donald Trump and COVID have exposed all of the fault lines in the United States, and we have a lot of work to do at home.
Thank you, Barbara. Alexander or Mikhail, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just
go ahead.
Go ahead, Mikhail. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so just a couple of points here. One is, on this Russia-China relationship, and is it an alliance? Is it an axis of convenience? Is it stable? Can we maneuver some sort of, Nixonian attempt to sort of break them off? There's been a lot of thought about this, and I actually think Central Asia is not the place to look for this kind of daylight. I think usually there's an assumption, aha, Central Asia, this is where their interests are going to obviously clash. In reality, what you've seen is, the spheres of influence and governance and engagement that China has gotten into have just expanded over the last 15 years, from becoming the region's main supplier of natural gas, diverting sort of that pipe gas into the east, to, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, to then an actual security presence in places like Tajikistan. All these spheres are spheres that Russia has traditionally been involved in. And so one might say, well, aren't the Russians going to wake up and see that sort of, China keeps sort of crossing the red lines? But the fact of the matter is both have an interest in keeping the relationship productive and focused on this alternative type of order building, right? And so managing whatever differences come up in Central Asia is absolutely secondary to not to having this unified front in public that they are both for sort of this broader democratization of international relations and sort of challenging the US-led world order. So Central Asia is probably the last place I would look for daylight in the Russian-Chinese relationship, because they've actually had to cope and accommodate to each other's interactions. And in fact, we have this now in the strategic concept, what President Putin referred to as, he welcomes a greater Eurasia, right? And so Russia is at the core of a greater Eurasia, which can also include Chinese-led integration. Presto, there is no contradiction there. So there's sort of a scaling up of Eurasia and this envisioning as a place where US and Western influence is decreasing. If you want to look for other areas to pry them apart, I would look in places like the Middle East. I would look places Southeast Asia, another place, but I don't think sort of Central Asia is it. One other point, just picks up on this last comment about getting our own house in order. There are absolutely severe domestic institutional political problems in the United States. And this idea that somehow we can use foreign policy as this mechanism to unite and sort of paper those over, I think we have another thing coming to us. There are real issues on questions of democracy, on questions of, should we spread liberal values, on our, institutional integrity, independence of institutions. All of these things are huge. And if you look at the polling between partisan Democrats and Republicans, you'll see very different conceptions of what constitutes the greatest threat. For Republicans, it's China, right? For the US, it's actually domestic issues like domestic militancy, white ethno-national movements, these kinds of things. And actually a big partisan split on Russia too, in terms of the percentage of Democrats that regard Russia as a threat versus Republicans. So, we really don't have a very basic foreign policy consensus against, what constitutes our main adversary or threat. And that's a real issue.
Thank you, Alexandra. Michael?
Yeah, if I'm just allowed to address I think one question that could have possibly been addressed to me, the one with regards to China's sort of prospects in relations with states in Eurasia. For all my admiration of China's economic model and its foreign policy and its lifting, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and investing in Central Asia and other places, I think China is not escaping the manifold nationalisms in the countries around it, and that's already generating a powerful pushback, or let's say balancing or checking China's influence. At this time it's checking, maybe going towards balancing, and then who knows, walking maybe. So those nationalisms are going to hobble China's, well, whatever you call it, expansion or just, penetration or whatever it is, even benign investment in many countries, especially in Eurasia, including Central Asia and apparently, Russia, Mongolia, and so forth. And secondly, the one that wasn't addressed to me, but there was this kind of discussion whether China and Russia may team up to attack Western interests, both in the east of Eurasia and in the west of Eurasia. I would be, again, I'm only speaking here in my personal capacity, so that's a view from Moscow, but that's not a Russian or the Russian perspective. But I think Russia will be hedging its bets in a situation if there's a conflict somewhere in, East Asia over Taiwan or something. I am not sure Russia is going to be just fully supportive of China's bid, and it's going to do China's bidding in that case. China has never recognized, Crimea or even, other things, supported many other things Russia has done in relations with the West. So I'm not sure Russia is going to oblige in this kind of situation. And that's my point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail. Very important point, and also important to note the significant joint military exercises that have been recently launched not that long ago by China and the Russian Federation, and increased security, defense security cooperation between Beijing and Moscow. I'd like to pose a question to our panelists, and perhaps Talha and Richard, if you would also look closely at this question, is where Turkey fits into the broader Biden policy towards Eurasia. Of course, it's a country that's looking to the West, has traditional partnerships with Russia and with China, but we've heard from Turkish officials that they want to be able to balance that relationship between Moscow and Washington, and they've been heavily pressing the Biden administration, particularly on this point, at a time when we've seen Washington, perhaps at least during this administration, cool off significantly towards their relations with, or at least the signals that they've been sending to Turkey, compared, frankly, to the previous administration, the Trump administration. So I'd like to pose this open question to our panelists, and maybe Talha and Richard would also look at this question on where does Turkey fit into the broader Eurasian equation for the U.S. under this new administration, and what would you perhaps recommend? And also, Mikhail, perhaps a question for you to look at as well.
Can I start?
Please.
Turkish position, especially in Central Asia, I think Turkey is part of Western alliance. So although despite in the last decade, Turkey has been excluded from European and NATO, and especially there have been significant problems with the US. But I think in terms of institutionalization, in terms of military structure, and in terms of the economic model, I think Turkey is still part of the Western alliance. Of course, Turkey wants to act autonomously in certain issues, and Turkey wants to maintain strong relations with Russia. But I think that's part of that equation. So Turkish efforts to strengthen ties with, especially Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and in the coming years, probably with Turkmenistan, and also strengthening ties with Azerbaijan are critical. I think there's a long-term investment on Turkey's behalf. So, of course, Turkey doesn't want to contradict and have problems with China or Russia, but I think Turkey's influence in the region would also maximize, Western interests as well. So, but this does not necessarily mean that Turkey wants to engage into competition or, any form of, power game with Russia or China. So that's, in terms of model, I think Turkey's expansion, Turkey's influence in the region will also increase European as well as, Western, I think, interests.
Thank you, Tal. A very important point for policymakers. Richard, real quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that Turkey is a natural space filler in a positive sense here. Turkey has been interested in the last 10 or 15 years in providing construction services, diplomatic engagement, and some military engagement, but with a light footprint in places the United States, frankly, doesn't want to invest much in. And that includes much of Africa, and it includes Central Asia. And I think the one thing that makes Turkey sort of the least bad space filler for all of these countries is that it gets along with all of these countries reasonably well. Yes, it's European and part of the European structure, but with significant frictions. Therefore, it's less threatening to Russia and China. Yes, it has certain competitive relationships with Russia, but it also does business with Russia, and they have sort of complementary models of foreign policy, realpolitik approach. And even with China, there's a strong sort of commercial component to that relationship. And in Afghanistan, as well as in the Turkic states of Central Asia, there are cultural ties, and Turkey wants to be involved and engaged in economic ways and diplomatic ways without being a hegemon in its own right. So I think this is in a situation where Turkey could be, and forgive me for forgetting which of our distinguished panelists made this point, that we need to avoid any single hegemon in that region. And if there's a power that can sort of be connective tissue and sort of increase commercial engagement, development, and respect the sovereignty of those states without exciting antibodies in the potential hegemons, it would be Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Richard, for wrapping that up for us. Well, that's all the time we have, and I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists and participants again for a very, very robust discussion and very insightful comments and questions all around. I'm Oubai Shahbandar, and I'm wishing you a good night here from Istanbul, from TRT World. Thank you again to all.